You're the first person to really groove with that. Everybody else has laughed immediately because it's sort of so like you're having margaritas in a sunset bar. But I personally like that tune.
Yeah, it's mad. It's groovy.
It's
It
not too
feels
bad.
good. You know, it's not like garage band or something straight off the bat, but
Yeah, it's like just cheesy enough.
No,
my other podcast has like a ripper theme song, but it's all wordplay and jokes about lifting weights. And I didn't think that was going to be appropriate for this one, which is not so much about lifting weights. to the audience, welcome to Delving Deeper. This is episode 6, and I'm joined by Julian, Zorsy, Sanchez. And Julian actually has the right to an expert opinion on my podcast music because by trade he is a music composer, and he produces and he performs as well. And he specializes in digital fusion and jazz arrangements. And he's sort of taken that expertise and combined it with his love for video games, which is actually how I know him. And so he's begun composing and arranging, or he's worked, I should say, in composing and arranging with for multiple Nintendo Switch titles through lots of indie game studios. And he even worked with Cartoon Network on, is it Steven Universe, the movie?
Yeah.
I have to admit, I haven't watched the movie. I aspire to that level of research for my podcast. Haven't got there yet. But he's worked with Cartoon Network. He's done games for the Nintendo Switch. And he's also a member and co-founder of the band The Consoles, which combines his passion, again, for jazz and video game music with some really sick covers, by the way. I've very much enjoyed watching some of them online. So, Julian, Zorsy, thank you so much for joining me, man. I really appreciate you giving me the time.
No worries. Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me on the show. It's cool. Thanks for reaching out. It was sick because, yeah, we obviously know each other from Smash, another, little fun side hobby of ours.
No, man, it's really cool. I sort of reached out within the community and said, because I'm very interested in the process of creating video games. I've thought about it for a long time as an art form that isn't really appreciated as an art form. Anybody who doesn't play games is probably throwing up in their mouth right now, but particularly in those games, and I first had this thought when I was playing Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time for the first time. Those games that actually do have, important narrative structures and themes and things like that, there are all of the same elements in how a game is composed as there are in, say, a movie, in conveying narrative and trying to evoke emotion in you. But people don't think of them like that. They think of them as a trivial pastime. And a very important part of evoking emotion, but also in sort of guiding you through, learning a game and understanding where you're meant to be and the roles of certain characters and things is in the musical score. And that's something that I've thought about quite a lot as well. Because I remember in high school, we studied program music and, we'd look at the Star Wars theme or whatever else John Williams was doing with Indiana Jones and so on. And we'd talk about how great it was. And I'd be thinking, wow, there's music in video games that's just as good as this. So when I reached out to the community and people said, hey, Zorsy writes music for games, I was like, I would love to talk to him. And when I went through your resume, I was like, wow, there's so much interesting stuff to cover here. So yeah, I'm very excited for this. It's combining a couple of my passions and interests, and it's actually stating a personal desire to know this stuff as much as anything else.
No,
so let's start at the very beginning, man. How did you get involved in music? How were you introduced to it?
Okay, so typically come from a Filipino Asian background, so there's a lot of us who parents recommend or start us early in playing piano, and I was no different. Started as a really young kid, and lo and behold, when I started, I completely despised it. There was condition, like already out of the womb, 4 or 5 years old, I was a gamer. I already knew that much, and my parents used to enforce this rule of like, however much you practice piano would be the time you'd be allowed to play video games, right? And I'd always find a way to skew it. I'd always like, yeah, Mom, I practice an hour and play video games for 2 hours or something like that. And eventually in the early years, as like before I was a teenager, I just never liked the process of it at first, and quit pretty young. But when I got into high school and eventually found that because when I was playing as a young child, I thought music, or piano particularly, was just classical music or music that I wasn't at the time fond of. It's different now, but I was exposed to a lot of stuff that I just didn't classify as music. And then lo and behold, YouTube came and there was a few people covering stuff from video games. So there was a pianist called Martin Lung, who also known as the blindfolded pianist, who did like Mario themes on the piano. And I was like, wait, what? You could play video game music on the piano or something? And that kind of spread the interest to get back into performing music. And I guess the rest is history. Yeah, like I picked it up again in high school, loved trying to learn video game music. As a result, I started to even like classical music, and towards the end of high school was more exposed to, I'd say, jazz and its idioms like hip hop and R&B and stuff like that. My brother was always listening to that stuff, so it was cool to give it more meaning, knowing that I knew how to play an instrument, that I could finally, these tunes that I kind of grew up with, I could play them, with people. And that's kind of led to now where I'm composing using all of that background, as well as performing a lot around town, gigging some of these songs I grew up with. So yeah, it's come full circle from not enjoying it at the very beginning.
It's interesting. I'm not sure whether your experience with this was the same as mine, but I found an interest in video game music was one of the first things to help me bridge my understanding of music theory slightly outside of just like very pop and rock oriented stuff. So, if you learn a 12-bar blues, I'm going to try and phrase this in ways that non-musicians would understand. But if you learn rock music or you learn blues music and things, there's sort of not so many melodic or harmonic options taken typically. And that familiarity is actually very helpful in conveying meaning and things within that genre. But, things are kept quite simple. 12-bar blues are built off the same three chords in the same pattern all the time. Makes things familiar and easy to follow along with. And when my music teachers begun talking about, different harmonic structures or even incorporating accidentals, so they're notes that sit outside of your home scale and things like that, often I'd sort of go like, I just can't envisage that in the canon of music that I most often listen to. And I went through a phase where, like I was saying, Ocarina of Time, I thought a lot of the music was quite beautiful. And so I was beginning to arrange some of it on guitar to sort of figure out, well, why do I like this? And being able to go through that and see some of those concepts at play, because program music does more often draw from things that sit a little bit more towards the classical side or the more traditional music side than just pure rock concepts. Being able to see some of those things at play actually made me come to understand that much more. And then it began to enrich my enjoyment of music more broadly again. And it's kind of funny how you just need that little gateway that opens the door. And then suddenly I came to quite enjoy orchestral music much more. But the thing that opened that door, like I said, was video game music,
Yeah.
I don't know if you felt the same.
That's 100% the same. I guess like when you begin to study the art form of video game music, you realize, relatively video game music is not even like 40 years old or something. And a lot of these composers had come from backgrounds. And as you delve deeper into the wormhole, you learn, such and such was inspired by Beethoven, Debussy, and all these like classical stuff that I grew up with, not giving the same recognition. But when you recontextualize it into a medium that's like, oh my God, this chord or this sequence or whatever you want to say, like, was very familiar when you pick any gaming moments, like you get the item pick from Zelda, those particular notes are not as common in traditional music, just straight up. So there was all these ways that techniques that composers use in video games are pre-existed in some fashion, but because we grow up with it as children, we associate it in many different ways. And like you said, that kind of helps me enrich my music theory understanding, but also just learn to enjoy that aspect and more music overall. Because I think video games, like, you can kind of say it's a genre, but even within video games, one of my favorite things about the genre is it's so broad. You can almost think of any genre that can fit within it, if you find a way to shape your narrative or characters or whatever. Yeah.
This is a slight tangent,
Mhm.
but I had sort of made a note that I had to tell you about it because it was quite exciting. When I was in the process of booking you for this podcast, I was also messaging my friend Locko McDonald, who was on episode 1.
Oh my gosh.
He's a music teacher.
Yeah.
And he was telling me that they're adding a unit to music in high school. I think it might be an HSC music unit, I'm not sure, that is actually video game music oriented. And so I believe they study some video game music, and I believe some Nintendo titles are part of the source material. And then the kids actually have to compose music for their own video games. So they have to think of little themes for things like finding an item and for deaths and completing a level and stuff like that, as well as creating overworld themes and boss battle stuff.
That's crazy.
And all of that too. It sounds like an incredible thing to be able to do, and something that I kind of wish that had been there, when I was going through high school.
For sure. The side tangent again, is Loco sax player?
Yeah, do you know him?
Yeah, I've played with him a few times. That's why, like you said the name, I thought you were trying to draw it back to me, but yeah.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah,
so Loco and I, we play in a band.
Oh my gosh, hectic. Yeah, sweet.
So his main project, Introspect, I don't play in, but we play in a covers band together. And yeah, Loco, he's a pro level sax player, but he's also a pro level guitarist and drummer. And I'm a guitarist and drummer. And so what sort of tends to happen within the band is whenever we have repertoire, whatever the easiest thing is, I just do that. He does the other one because it's going to be better that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
You know him.
Yeah, I have funny stories off podcast to say. So
no, that's fantastic. The delving deeper universe, the lore's getting bigger. That's sick. Yeah. I wanted to go back a little bit to when you were introduced to music, because it's interesting to me. I think there is something cultural in this. You sort of said like how lots of Asian kids are pushed to learn piano. And I definitely remember I had a couple of Chinese kids in my year who were like the piano prodigies that had been having to learn piano from the age of 4 or whatever. I love music, and my dad is just obsessed with it. Has been his whole life. I think that his heart has always been in music more than almost anything else. And so when he eventually retired from his main career, which was working in finance, he opened a music store, and he sort of made it part of his mission to make music accessible and give people the experience of playing as much as he can, because he's just so passionate about it. And when I was younger, I was exposed to music as well, but always in the context of play. I was never forced to pick anything up, but we had guitars lying around the house I could pick up whenever. We had a set of bongos and a tambourine, and God help my dad, he gave me those bongos and the tambourine whenever he was playing guitar or whenever he was playing piano. And if he was playing, we were having a sing-along, no matter how badly I did it. But he did that with myself, my sister, and my little brother day in, day out. And so to us, music was always something that was fun, and it was always explorative and kind of celebratory. So we had a song that it always started with a verse about if you find a spider in the garden. It had this cute little melody, and it would go like, if you catch a spider in the garden today, put it in a jar so it won't get away. And then there was this refrain of like, I want to let the spider go, don't let it go, blah, 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 blah. But we would play that, and we would just improvise verse after verse of, what if we found a hippo? Where could you keep the hippo? Oh, you keep it in the pool. What if you find a snake? Oh, you keep it in the washing machine, whatever. But we would just do that over and over again. So music was always fun. And there was never a moment where when my parents said, do you want to learn an instrument, where I would ever have gone, oh, like not another chore like that. It was always a joy to me.
Yeah.
And in some ways I actually found it harder when I went to learn instruments to be very dedicated to the mechanical aspects of it, because I always thought music was to play. So this is probably a bit like the way I play Smash, to be honest. I was always like, my enjoyment of it was right up here, and I'm happy to spend time on it, but God forbid that I would ever do the things that would make me good at it.
Yeah.
That's how I was with music as well. I was very much not technically inclined. And so I had to go back and fill those things in, but I had a love for it always, And I find it interesting that your exposure was the opposite way around, were you to be introducing somebody to music now, how would you start? Would you want to go back and walk the same path that you had?
I don't think it's like, that's a good question. In regards to my parents, like they made me start piano, and the good thing is they never like forced me when they found out that it wasn't for me when I started, right? Like I did it a year or two, but you know when you're really young, I mean, I experienced this because I'm still a piano teacher, right? There's many students that I do teach who you can tell that they're kind of being forced into it or encouraged. But when you're younger than a teenager, it's almost like you don't have your own identity or knowing what is like something you will enjoy or you won't enjoy. But if I were to, pass on to music or to try and get, let's say I had a child or just, someone younger to get into music, I think the angle that I come from now to try and make it fun is a little bit similar. At first of like, this is for playing, and most of what I do for a living or in the genres I specialize in now, which is jazz, is like a lot of improvising. And, that's for another topic of like improvising and melee, because they go hand in hand to me. But I feel just understanding the aspect of like playing with people and enjoying music together, that that sounds a little bit of like what you were saying with your spider in the garden kind of like past. I would kind of introduce someone to music in that sense, and if it sparked some form of excitement in them, then I would try to promote the rigid side, never enforce it though. And I think when I'm teaching students, it's hard because there's so many good teachers out there, but a lot of them will have to teach a certain syllabus or whatever. And just like my personality, just like my music preference, just like how I play Smash, there's a lot of things that I do that are kind of ad hoc or improvised. And when I take a student, for example, I try and figure out as quick as I can the learning process that they prefer or what makes them excited about music, and teach them in that sense rather than just be like, all right, here's book, go. And for some students that might work well, there's some students who learn very well in a classical rigid sense, and there's some who just kind of like the colors or the sounds of hearing notes and stuff. And there's some kids who just straight up don't like music, right? And as much as I can, even if down the line they're going to stop music, it's still important aspect to try and make these kids or anyone enjoy music as much as they can. And yeah, you never know. So I guess that would be my answer.
In sport, there's a concept for long-term athletic development, where in youth sport, one of the things you really want to do is delay early specialization and delay, not necessarily delay exposure to competition, but delay competition itself or results being the first priority. And there's a number of reasons for it, particularly in sport, because so much of your ability is determined by how physically developed you are. You run the risk, if you determine who's likely to be a talented rugby player at the age of 12, when some kids have hit puberty and some haven't, then what happens is you pick the kids who've hit puberty, even if they're actually no more innately talented than somebody who's running 2 years behind. And, suddenly you end up sort of forcing people into these divergent paths, and you've actually predetermined their destiny. But there's other ones as well, because really early specialization means people don't necessarily get exposed to the general stressors that develop a whole bunch of general skills that make them both more resilient and faster learners as athletes later. And it's also associated with burnout. And so one of the things that they say is probably best for long-term athletic development is just fostering a love of training or a love of sport in kids by giving them lots of exposure to play, a lot less structured practice, and a lot more variety. And then as time goes on, people almost begin to self-select into higher engagement and so on as they go through. And it sort of echoes a lot of what you were saying in music, where if you give people lots of tools and you let them engage on their level, eventually the ones who really love it will start taking things a little bit more seriously, and you can guide them down that path. But you can't force them.
Yeah.
And so in hearing that, that was the first thing that came to mind. Is it's astonishing how many similarities, like you draw analogies from music to Smash. I very often draw analogies from, from training and coaching to Smash and music and other things in life. And it's just, it was funny to me hearing that. We're 20 minutes in. I haven't asked you a single thing about composing yet.
Oh, this is cool.
Kind of getting there.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
When did you start wanting to write music?
I would say towards the end of high school, there's a part of me that really wanted to eventually compose for video games. I'd always tell people that would be my like dream job, even if the journey getting to this point wasn't as like linear towards it. Probably my favorite, I don't want to say franchise, but let's just go game studio. Like Square Enix is probably my favorite game studio in terms of music. There's so much from every single Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, all these, so much history and musical enrichment from those games that I remember one of the victory points I'd think of was like, similarly at first, when my parents knew I was playing video game music, it's similar to drawing parallels of like people pursuing video games as a career, like esport athletes, for example. It's to the older gen, it's kind of like a foreign thing. It's like, why would you do that for a living? Blah, blah, blah. It's obviously a lot more accepted now. But when my parents first thought of me playing video game music, the initial thought was like, oh, this isn't real music. But then eventually, as I got better at playing piano and I started playing more difficult piano arrangements from those games, my parents wouldn't even know where, like, it's like, oh, I love that Chopin or Beethoven piece. I was like, got you. Like, it's not. It's, Uematsu wrote this. And all of a sudden, my parents began to just like the music, even if it wasn't something they actively listened for. So it wasn't long before they were pretty supportive of, I guess, the type of music I was doing. And around that time, I was like, man, if I was never going to stop gaming, but if I could create an experience and emotions through this of like, I just love the idea of building a world. And sometimes it's nice to have that detachment from the real world. Obviously, I still listen to a lot of music outside of video games. I do it for work, for weddings and stuff. And one of my favorite things about video game music in particular, how we were talking about narrative driven and stuff, is that when you listen to a piece of video game music, because of the absence of things like lyrics, the person who's engaging with it is kind of forced to derive their own meaning of what they're hearing. And that's one of my favorite things. If I'm driving in the car and I have someone who is or isn't a video game lover, I sometimes like playing things in the car. I was like, so like, what do you think of when you hear this? And sometimes I do that to kind of gauge my own music. If I'm like writing for a game, it's like, I'll play something in the car. I was like, okay, what scenario do you hear for this? And sometimes people land the thing that I was going for, but I personally enjoy it a lot more when it's something so out there to what I was intending to do, because it's like, it's crazy that you drew this meaning out of it. And I think from like, human condition and emotions, I think during puberty or the teenage, your edgy years or whatever, that's like, that was the period where I was heavily invested into learning video game music. And similarly, when I wanted to, okay, you know what? I think I want to write video game music as a career. And whilst it's not the main thing, it's not a full-time thing for me yet. It's slowly working to that realization these days. So, yeah.
When when I listen to certain music, I actually spoke about this with Loco on the podcast. Music has this incredible ability to evoke a sense of place or evoke a sense of nostalgia and stuff in you. So there are certain albums where I remember listening to them the first time I went traveling overseas on my own, and it sort of takes me back to that place.
Yeah.
There are certain albums that I listened to, in old relationships or things like that, where when I listen to them, all I can do is sort of be transported back to that place. It's very difficult to escape that.
Mm-hmm.
And in some part, I think that all of the best program music that I think of, part of why it evokes a certain emotion in me is because it brings me back to that piece of art and its meaning in that context. So, you know, if you think of Lord of the Rings and the theme of the Fellowship, it's such a powerful sort of piece of music, but you can't sort of listen to it knowing what it is without thinking of their journey. And same with like the theme of Pirates of the Caribbean,
Sure.
right? You hear that and you're on a ship. You can't get away from that.
Yeah.
And so something I find really funny is this idea of sort of being forced to compose music for a game when you don't already have that association there and try and capture that emotion. And I remember I used to write quite a lot of music in my teenage years. None of it particularly good, I'd say. But, you know, I wrote quite a lot. And I always was able to, if I had a musical theme that I was exploring, I could write to that. And if I had sort of envisaged a song in my head, I could try and bring that song to reality. But I found it very hard to write to a directive. We had a few assignments in school where they'd say, write a song using whatever it is, like a song in this genre or a song to accompany this picture or something. That to me was always very difficult. So for you, how do you sort of take somebody else's concept of what they want to evoke, look at that stimulus, and then start putting pen to paper or your hand to the keys and try and bring that emotion out? Do you go somewhere for a similar feeling and try and draw from it? Like, what do you do?
If there's an opportunity to, you know, I love nature, and if there was an opportunity to physically take myself somewhere, I mean, you know, granted the last 2 years we're stuck in this supposed pandemic, but if there was a opportunity for me to go traveling, I find that a lot of my favorite or best work has come from traveling. You know, it was very fitting. The first game that I worked on was called Kana Quest, and name speaks. It's kind of like a puzzle game that teaches you how to read hiragana and katakana, Japanese, right? And prior to this pandemic, I was going to Japan twice a year. Just for one, I love the country. Two, I was kind of working a bit. Some of my band used to be based in Japan, so it was perfect for me. And it was very, very fitting getting this gig from a Melbourne developer who, you know, kind of wanted these Japanese-inspired melodies to fuse with a modern chiptune thing. So very heavy chiptune influences with some more modern production elements or whatever. And that was something that was a bit more up my alley from a job standpoint. But even just being in Japan, like I landed the gig right before I went to Japan, which was perfect because I started writing the soundtrack in a capsule hotel, you know, and I'd be walking around Japan, even just anything as audible as hearing like people talk in real life or all the jingles you'd hear in the stations and whatnot. It was, in that scenario, it was perfect. But with more recent stuff or situations where I'm a bit more, you know, excuse the pun, locked down, I guess a lot of it comes down to, I try and gauge for like from the initial word description. Okay, see, you know, I might write down some keywords and be okay, cheery, charismatic, cute, whatever. Or as much as I can, I like to inversely interview the dev and be like, okay, so like, what kind of music do you like? Can you give me some examples? What are your favorite things? As much examples as you can. I've been really lucky in my line of game composing that nearly every single one of the game developers I've worked with has had some level of musical intellect. So, you know, they could give me some direction, but there have been cases outside of video games. Let's say I've done short film where there hasn't been much, you have to work with adjectives, and you have to kind of align your understanding of a word with their understanding of a word, right? And that can be quite tricky, but I guess as like, even though I'm the one that's being hired, and let's say in most like the situation, the expertise should be in my field of writing the music compared to the developer who hires me, I still go in being the, I guess, initiating all these questions are like, okay, so what do you like about this, blah, blah, blah. And I think trying to be as open in communication, I mean, that works for any industry, but especially when you're trying to build someone else's world, trying to learn what they like is probably the most important skill. And once I've got that kind of locked down, most of what I do starts from either, if I'm at a piano, improvising, like whether it's image or words, I'd put up on a screen and just start improvising away, see if something clicks, see if something's catchy to me. Because if it's not catchy to me, it's not going to be catchy for anyone. But also whether it suits the mood. That's if I'm at a piano, because, that's my main instrument. Other times, if I'm like, I have a lot of clarity when I'm driving, and sometimes it's just a matter of like, oh, shit, I've got something. Voice memo. Okay, pull out voice memos, sing something back with a terrible pitch, If it's enough to kind of get an idea. Everything to me kind of starts as a piano sketch in terms of emotive music. Or other times, for some of the more recent games I've worked on, like I've worked on kind of frantic party games. I guess you could say, like games that are a bit like the Mario Party kind of frantic stuff. So,
yeah, just chaotic.
Yeah, chaos. And sometimes it's just a matter of like, okay, this needs to just feel good. And it could be, at that time, it's like, all right, let me just try and work on a beat. Because a developer, so I worked in a game called Boomerang Fu, which is exactly the, symptoms of being a chaotic, frantic brawler game. He worked on a couple of songs for the game as well himself, and he was heavily inspired by like DMX and hip hop and stuff. But the aesthetic is like very cute Fruit Ninja, like you're a banana throwing a boomerang, trying to destroy other fruit, right? So it's cute, but he wanted it to feel both like trippy, dark, and like boppy, And so, all right, you know what? Screw it. I'm gonna make a fat beat today and see if I can like tune in some cuteness later, So I would say most of the time it's understanding the vision, getting as much influence and inspirations from the developer, sketching away at the piano, or trying to evoke the first step of the emotion or feeling you're trying to get out of the game. Yeah.
And so you mentioned sort of getting some artistic direction when you were doing this stuff. People would give you adjectives or show you music that they liked. Do they ever give you limitations on the sort of palette that you ought to use? So like, we want a very stringy arrangement, or we want piano music, or we want it to be only percussive and have no real melody? Or do they leave that very much in your hands?
I think that it's kind of 50-50. I would say half of the time they go in knowing that like for this part of the score, we want something quite simplistic. I haven't had any cases where a developer has been too restrictive on a musical group, for example, but a lot of their influences might imply said thing. Like, okay, this isn't a grand orchestral thing. It's quite minimal. It might just be like a kick and a snare and an acoustic guitar, Animal Crossing, right? So like they said Animal Crossing, and I'm like, okay, I can't go too ham. And I think that once I've gotten a vibe of what they do like, as a composer, I don't just want to be a composer that fulfills the fulfills the role or fulfills the job. I definitely like to push as many boundaries as I can and be. I'm more on the overly ambitious side than I am on the conservative side, and I think that sums me up in almost everything I do, from the character I play in Smash, blah 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 blah. Like, there's so many times that I think that I'm given a stimulus and I just want to stretch it. So yeah, there hasn't been too many restrictions from the initial conception, apart from, the references. But sometimes, like, as I've delivered stems and as I've delivered, draft ideas, I'd be like, okay, actually, let's tone it down a bit. I kind of want this vibe. Okay, cool, good to know. But as much as possible, I kind of want to stretch it out and see what I can do to provide, like, not just a formula that's already been done by, amazing predecessors before me, but what can I bring to the table that's very different?
I imagine when you write music for a game or for a movie,
mm-hmm.
that you start on the very outside with sort of a broad palette. So, you mentioned like Animal Crossing giving you an idea like, hey, we want a kick drum and an acoustic guitar. And I used the example of Lord of the Rings earlier. It was like, this is going to be grand and orchestral. So that gives you an idea of your creative bounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I imagine that you almost zoom in. So maybe you from there start thinking, well, what types of themes are we going to use for our overworlds or our bigger characters and so on. And then the little parts might emerge from that. So if we take that to a video game context and think Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time's iconic, so we can use that. There's a sort of broad, orchestral type of arrangement behind things that gives you an idea of genre. And we've got sort of ideas of what the types of themes are going to be like on each of the worlds. And then when it comes down to the noises that it makes when you find an item or clear a level or whatever it happens to be, it feels like all of those bits sit together. I don't know if that rings true to you, but if it does, when you start thinking of the sub pieces within a game that you have to orchestrate for, and I'm sure there are many depending on what type of game you do, what types of cues do you look for to say, well, how am I going to take this palette in the right direction for this character or this world or this specific, moment in the game that I'm writing music for?
Okay, that's a good question. I think
it's probably a hard one. Sorry.
No. I can definitely answer it, and I guess I'll phrase it in this sense. So, I would love to compose for, like JRPGs or RPGs where a lot of this motive-driven stuff is, very integral. And there's many times that I've done this for practice, whether it's settings or characters. And I guess for me, I treat the first thing that comes to mind when I think of composing for a set character or whatever is either particular melodies, sketching out a few different melodies, or even just like particular instruments reflecting certain things. Ocarina of Time, Ocarina, there's so much of that. Like, that game alone popularized the instrument of the ocarina. And there's so many people outside of the video game world that are like, starting to take on ocarina as a important orchestral instrument. Maybe because of the, because of the game or not. But I think when I'm given a set palette to work with and to focus in on, building specific things, I think that... Give me a couple of seconds.
No, you're right.
I think that... Give me...
Well, let me phrase this a different way.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Imagine that we're going to write music, you and I together.
Mm-hmm.
And the game that we're writing the music for is just going to be the adventures of Zorsy and Will. And it's a pretty whimsical game where, we traipse up and down the main streets of Sydney,
mm-hmm.
and we play Nintendo against people that we meet, and we can form friends and enemies and, advance our cause in whatever we're doing. And that's pretty much all we do. It's just fun.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that sounds like a kind of whimsical adventure. And so I imagine that I'd have some upbeat kind of fun music that felt quite childish in the background.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Well, let's imagine within that world that you and I are different characters.
Okay.
And I'm going to be the more serious one who gets a little bit glum. and we'll make you the whip smart one who's always one step ahead of the game, but puts himself in high pressure situations, let's say.
Sure.
All right. So I am grumpy and glum, and you are sharp and quick.
Uh-huh.
Within that context, if you were to sit at your piano, how would you begin exploring yourself as a character in that scenario versus me? What would be the first thing that would come to mind?
All right. I'm gonna try and figure out ways to word this in a musical end for those who are listening who aren't, as musically inclined, because it
must be hard as well because you don't have a piano to show me your ideas right now.
I do, but it's not routed in, so it's not like as easy to. Oh, yeah, it's not as easy. I think there's definitely a lot of musical techniques from scales, modes, and whatnot that could help you convey particular emotion. So stemming from just happy and sad, one of the first things we learn in music is like major and minor. One reflecting happy, one reflecting sad. And it goes a lot further than that, a certain set of notes can convey different meanings, but not just with that's in retaining to pitch, like you might have spooky or cute music that plays in a super high register. So anything from as simple as Resident Evil or any of the horror games, Silent Hill, but even things like Animal Crossing could be implied as cute. And honestly, the only difference between those two soundtracks might just be the combination of notes you play at that given time, right? But outside of just pitch and the notes that you play, in that range, there's also, I think, one of the most broken things of music, or the things that convey so much emotion, is, everyone has rhythm, but the inclusion and the absence of it can imply so many things, right? Outside, like, obviously I'll get back to the question properly, but I think going back to the importance of video game music, if you removed those music from a game, the experience would be completely different. And that's why, particular games like Metroid Dread had just come out, and most of the soundtrack's quite, atmospheric or ambient. It's not tunes that you sing to, but the absence of hearing sound at those given moments makes it really freaky in comparison to when you encounter the particular, they're called Emmys in the game, these kind of stalker robots, and it's all this really high-pitched strings and percussive drums. Like, just hearing the intro is making you go, oh shit, I need to, like, it's super intense. And if we were to kind of dissect, the two characters of Will and Zorsy and what they are, a combination of those notes might help. A combination of, in music, whenever you play two notes at the same time, it's called an interval, or like the space between them can imply certain things. So sometimes notes that are really, really right next to each other can sound kind of cute or childish, especially if they're in a high register. But if you play those same two notes all the way down at the bottom of a piano, it could sound real creepy. So it could sound like a mouse, but those same two notes could be the same two notes that are used for something like Jaws, which is always a very popular example that people use. It's just two notes which are right next to each other, and it gets faster and faster, so it gets more tense. And let's say there was a situation that the Will character was, grumpy, or starting his temper or his emotion was starting to build. There's ways you could musically, get to it, and you're like, this. You hear stuff like that all the time, but you are about to know that, something's going to happen. He's about to get grumpy. And that's just the beginning from a piano standpoint, right? I think if we were thinking of other instruments, even though I'm primarily a piano player, I can play a bunch of different instruments enough to be able to write for them competently. And drums is probably, if I could relive my life and start fresh from the beginning, I'd want to learn drums. I can play drums enough, but even the sound of drums, like a lot of music producers and composers these days work in what we call digital audio workstations, DAWs or whatever. And it's so cool to be able to compose now because just from our computers and what we can program, we have access to all these sounds of instruments that we may never physically own. And part of that process involves samples. Samples are, just bite-sized audio snippets, and there's millions out there. Any sound you create can be turned into something musical or sound design. And something as simple as a kick drum could come in the form of, just the mouth beatboxing or an actual drum, right? And each type of sample that you hear and you play can have a associated emotion or feeling attributed towards it. Like, oh, that kick is really distorted and gritty, right? So it's really easy to okay, if you were to say, Zorsy and Will, which would that kick be in relation to another one, which sounds like a pop? Who is that more appropriate for? And the fun part as a composer is trying to, it's kind of this push and pull of drawing a comparison of, okay, this is my range. This one in comparison to this one sounds more aggressive. So it'd be in your head, you might align that. Okay, this might be more aligned to Will. This one sounds very soft and bubbly. And look, all of these things are subjective, there is no necessary right or wrong, but better composers convey, I guess, a set that evokes meaning into a game. And I think that from exploring sound alone, whether that was from, like I said, samples or what I have in my computer versus the real world, there are so many things that come with the emotions of being spontaneous or angry. And what sounds can do that, and I feel that's a question that many people who even aren't musically inclined can answer, which is really cool. Yeah. So
no, that was a very interesting way of taking it. When you were talking about that, something that came to mind is I mentioned before how with program music, we almost can't dissociate what we hear from the thing that's associated with. But in some ways, that means there's a two-way relationship between what you hear and what you see and their meanings. So, for example, the Harry Potter theme is a terrific piece of music for evoking just a little bit of spookiness, because that first phrase doesn't quite resolve the way you would expect. So you're like, oh. And so it sounds a little bit magical and a little bit oddball-ish and stuff, but its meaning is amplified enormously by the fact that it is the Harry Potter theme. It's put next to Harry Potter. And so obviously that music's going to be a bit sort of witchy, because that's what it is.
Yeah.
And I guess for you, when you say all these things are open to interpretation, as the composer, you almost have the chance to determine what is the person who plays this game's first exposure to this theme going to be, which means that because you associate it with another clue as to its meaning, you're kind of getting to define meaning. It's like defining terms in an argument. You say, let's agree on what this means. And then because you've got that stake in the ground, you can probably use that for the rest of your musical composition and kind of call back to that idea.
Yeah.
Boomy, distorted things mean scary in this game, as opposed to being an exciting explosion or whatever it happens to be,
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I think, there's so there's so I'm a Dave Chappelle fan, and I know there's a lot of controversy with who he is. But
controversy is good right now. We're trying to build this podcast rating up, so say the roguish things you can. Yeah,
awesome. But no, outside of that, he won a Mark Twain Award and there's something I've always loved about his acceptance speech. And I think the same applies to what I'm trying to convey as a music composer for games. But in comedy, he says that the quote actually comes from Robin Williams, and I'm probably going to paraphrase it because I can't exactly remember, but when a comedian is on stage, whenever they're talking, they are speaking the truth, not the objective truth, but their truth. And you could never argue with the art form because what they're saying, it is them, that is their story. So even as I am trying to, this is my way of designing or creating this world. And if you listen back to it, you cannot argue with that because this is what I created. You can't just be like, Link talks. He's supposed that's what. Well, that was a design choice, or the many other elements. No, Bowser's the good guy. It's like, and it's cool. Like it's cool that there's so many theories, game theorists, or whatever, in any form of medium, and it's cool because I think my other favorite thing about the medium of video game is just the discourse of like how many ways people can interpret it, but you can never, I guess, I don't want to say you can never, but at least from the angle of me being the composer, if I decided that this was meant to be aggressive or like, someone interviewed me and is like, oh, when you designed Will Berkman's theme or whatever, why did you use like this kick? Yeah, well, because I thought this would objectively, in my mind, creative mind, this was the correct one. This is the meaning that I wanted to convey. And sure, maybe someone might have a better solution, but they're not the ones that wrote for it at that given time, And look, that hopefully that doesn't come from a pretentious spot, but because every piece of music that I've listened to, I know that if I, took it now, I was like, I could do better. And there's always the cycle in an artist's mind of how do we, it's always this, we're our harshest critic, always. But I think when you've created a world or when you've created something, that becomes, you're writing the truth of like your intention. So, yeah.
Well, you can certainly change. You are having a say in the experience that someone's going to have. And the best example I have for this is one that's entirely comedic. You can change people's experience of anything by putting it to different music. And so obviously you're exerting your artistic license in saying this is the music I think will convey this experience most authentically. Mm-hmm. But there's a video clip that I think is from like Enter the Dragon or something. It's Chuck Norris. And he's about to fight this Chinese guy. It's not Bruce Lee, but it's some Chinese kung fu dude. And they agree to fight, and they take off their robes. And the original thing is, the movie music of them getting ready to fight and rah rah rah. But somebody has put it over Careless Whisper as they start disrobing, and it's hysterically funny. Because it completely changes the meaning of that scene and your experience in watching it. And so, again, obviously that's done deliberately to be incongruous and inappropriate. Mm-hmm. But if you take that from like, the very end of the spectrum and move it back into the realm of sort of sanity, you can see how different artistic directions are going to change what people experience. And like you said, no one can tell you whether you're right or wrong, and they can't say that you ought to have done it a different way. It's just your attempt to most authentically convey this is what we're going for here,
And I guess like when I talked about the comedy quote, it's more that like it's the truth of the art form, not exactly, at the end of the day, anyone who receives it, so many comedians or so many art is always discussed on either end. It's just going to happen regardless. And I think art does that. Art is going to offer so many different opinions. Video games are not, video games are a part of that too. So when I say it's the truth, it's more like the truth of the art of composing rather than like, you can still have your subjective opinions of whether, oh no, that was shit or that was good or whatever it is, but yeah, like it's interesting hearing like there's so many times when there's video game challenges for composers where, okay, this week's theme is winter themes, and hearing, like how someone else's approach is really different to yours. And yeah, I'm very much intrigued by everyone else's, I guess, artistic decisions to paint that picture. But yeah.
So when we listen to program music in movies, TV, whatever, the music's evoking a sense of place, So again, Lord of the Rings, you hear that theme, you know what's up every time.
Mm-hmm.
But in video games, it's actually like a very important sort of part of how the game itself functions. And we used Legend of Zelda as an example before, because there are musical themes that are clues. They tell you when you've made achievements, where you ought to go. There's even that bit in the Lost Woods where the way you find out which door takes you out is that the musical theme, as you approach the door, disappears. But music is an integral part of actually cluing you through the game and guiding your actions.
Mm-hmm.
So right at the start, when I was talking about how video games are maybe underappreciated as an art form, part of the thing that I think makes them so evocative is that in everything else you do, you're like passively consuming what the characters in front of you are doing.
Yes.
I read Lord of the Rings. Aragorn's heroism has nothing to do with me. I like to think I'm like him, but I'm probably not. I'm just reading what he supposedly did.
Yeah.
Whereas in The Legend of Zelda, Link is saving the world, but he is my avatar. And so my decisions reflect him. And in certain video games, they really play on that idea, which is why the idea of building your avatar and, scaling them up or whatever is important to you. But I guess what I'm getting at here is like the musical cues walk you through the game, and they give you so much information as well in that respect. But then in certain genres of video games, like a rhythm game, I know you've composed for one of them, the music is actually the foundation of the game itself. All of your actions are timed to the music.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other games like, say, Smash that we both play, where the music doesn't really serve any particular purpose as far as like the mechanics of the game go, but it's still really important for atmosphere.
Yeah.
And so for you, when you get briefs for different types of games, how does knowing the way in which the game itself has to function start impacting your musical choices?
I think the general scope of knowing something, as soon as you put a genre label on something, brawler, rhythm game, platformer, puzzle, that already kind of builds the palette that you'd be working on, or how involved. Like I mentioned before, I would really love to write for a JRPG, because I feel at least, narrative-driven games tie in with, world building and character motifs and emotions, and up until this point, plug, I haven't had the opportunity to, write for something like that. But in cases like rhythm games, it becomes, at first I was like, oh yeah, I just get to make music, and then that's it. Like, you start tapping away at my music. But no, like, rhythm game has been, so out of all the games I've done so far, rhythm game has been the most interesting, because you essentially from the get-go are acting as a level designer, and again, the developer that I'm working with for the current game that I'm working on, which is called Bits and Bobs, he is not musically trained, but has a lot of experience in rhythm games, so has enough information to talk on a musical level with me, which is really cool. But we go back and forth before starting a song. He might just be like, hey, look, I want to, okay, cool, we've got these couple of songs. I want to work with something that's 160 BPM. So, that's something quite fast in relation to some of the other songs we have in the game. And all of a sudden that may limit how ambitious I want to be with things like rhythm. And, it's in the title of the genre, rhythm games. What I might do with the drum kit would have to kind of make sense or correlate with what the player is supposed to hit. And in settings like that, the process is different. Because okay, I'm working on a 160 BPM track. I might just essentially start with a drum track first, and that is actually the case for that game because I'm figuring out rhythms that the player, you have to go with it, assuming that not everyone that plays this game is musical, but they might still love rhythm games, and you need to all of a sudden think about accessibility in it. So it's quite challenging and really fun because compared to other things, I get to design how hard the game is going to be. I could be the reason someone complains like, this game is too hard or whatever. Like,
I bet a lot of musicians would be tempted to do that as well, because if there's one thing that musicians are sometimes accused of, it's elitism.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
You can do a lot of very counterintuitive things with rhythm that would absolutely get in people's heads. And if you really wanted to flex your musical muscles on these poor gamers, you definitely could.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, in regards to that game, the developer definitely keeps me in check. But at the same time, man, he's the one who's asked me, like, there's a song I'm working on which is in 7. So for those not musically as inclined, most of the time we listen to music, it's in a tempo of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you start to have odd numbers like 5 or 7, it doesn't feel or sound natural. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2. It starts to feel weird. And this
Pink Floyd's Money for people who are trying to relate that to a song they know.
Yeah.
Pink Floyd's Money, Tap Your Foot, and it sounds kind of natural, but it sounds a bit weird because it just always it feels jumpy because each new bar starts just before you expect.
Yeah. So in cases like that, this developer has been really cool to allow, obviously, odd meter or, songs in the time of 5 or 7 would be things that are more advanced for later parts of the game. Cause I think we're trying to design the game as a arcade style kind of thing, stage 1 to X amount. Right. So in that case, it's a really fun challenge, and I've had to learn other skills outside of just working in my, computer for like the music software I work with to be able to do it. So some composers, work in actual game software like Unity, or there's a really popular one for integrating music called Fmod, and these softwares allow us to see how our music operates in game for interactivity. And especially in this day and age, 30, 40 years later, a lot of music is becoming interactive, or there's a word I'm blanking out on it. But interactive music that changes as the pace of, we're no longer just making a piece of music. As the character models, move inside a zone, that might affect the music. And a really good example of this is, like, let's say you play Sonic or Mario or any form of platformer. You're listening to the cheery, upbeat, overworld stuff, and then you go into water. And then all of a sudden, there's an effect called a filter, and that all of a sudden affects the whole song. And some of these features need to be considered when you're composing music that is quite dynamic. Dynamic music. Yeah, that's I think what I was going for. But wait, what was the original question?
We were talking about how like genre and conventions impacts the way in which you play, and then you were talking about this rhythm game. But what you actually began talking about is a really, really good segue into something that I wanted to ask you. Mm-hmm. So, do you ever watch the YouTube channel 8-Bit Music Theory?
Yep. Hell yeah.
Fantastic YouTube channel. If anybody's listening to this that doesn't watch it, even if you don't like music, incredible. But I got down a big rabbit hole. I was watching them, and then I ended up on all these other videos. And I watched a really interesting video about the creative limitations on whoever composed the music for the first Pokemon games. Mm-hmm. Because when you were working with a Game Boy cartridge, you were very limited with your sound palette, how many notes could be playing at once, so on, even what you could do rhythmically. Mm. And so it's incredible because that's some of the most iconic video game music really evocative, incredibly well done, but it was done with enormous limitations. So the two questions for you is, do you ever, like, now that video games have advanced a long way since Game Boy cartridges, do you still ever have limitations on what you can do from a purely technological perspective? And two, when you do, does that ever actually help, like, refine your thinking?
Yeah, so there's still definitely restrictions. There's always going to be part of it comes down to, I hate to word it this way, but part of it comes down to budget and money, of course, because, I think the ideal thing would be, if we could all just record a whole soundtrack with live instruments and stuff, that would be the dream. And, Platinum games, AAA games, even Nintendo, a lot of their newer stuff can afford budgets for orchestras and stuff. And when composers or when developers want an orchestral soundtrack of some sort, and I'm just a single composer, there's still limitations, even though there's libraries, sample libraries of, you can buy an orchestra, a virtual orchestra, and compose with it. So there's still going to be technical limitations, and like we kind of spoke about before, there's still going to be games that call for a restricted palette. But I find that restrictions, and I kind of apply this to just the process of learning, restrictions are probably the best way to learn something, drawing parallels to, let's say, Smash, for example. If you ask any player better than you in the game for the broad question, what should I work on? It's so hard to pinpoint something, but it's like, oh, you need to work on this element of your gameplay. Focus on that. Focus on recovering. Similarly, when we were talking about 8-bit, because they were limited by 4 channels mainly, 4 channels was also inclusive of sound effects. So here's a fun fact. If you're playing Super Mario, dun, 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 when you hear that, there's 3 voices that are playing the main melody notes, and then a noise channel which is doing the. So there's only 3 channels of notes, and when you play piano arrangements of it, your hands will only be playing 3 notes at the same time. Obviously, there's that noise, that's the percussion. But the really cool thing is that if you were to get a power-up, because you are restricted to 4 channels of audio, what that meant was one of the sound effects had to replace one of the channels of music, right? So sometimes you might hear like the little drums thing be quiet, and you hear the coin noise instead, right? Composers back then would be so restricted that they needed to make something sound full with what they had. And the same could still be applied to today. And it's kind of good that as you start as a composer and work towards, as you build your career, but whatever, you get access to more studio gear or more, like I said, virtual instruments, or the ability to fund having real players. And your skills as a composer, a producer, whatever, they get sharpened by the absence of. If you don't have a real violin to work with, if you want that in your score, you have to learn audio techniques to best manipulate this sound to sound like a real violin, whether it's just dialing what we call automation, making volumes go in and out, because the beauty of a violin is that even if they're sustaining one note, they can go louder and softer. Piano, you can't. If you play a note, it's only going to decrease in volume from that point. Same with like guitar and whatnot. But with a violin, they can choose to bring the sound louder or softer. And if you don't have the right tools, or if you don't have the luxury of working with a violin player, then you need to figure out how to achieve that in your actual software. So there's always going to be so many techniques that you learn along the way. And I'm kind of one of my favorite things about my favorite video game soundtracks is the fact that if you listen to Final Fantasy, or let's just say RPGs or music from the 90s. Wait, Ocarina was in the 90s, right?
Yeah, I think 98, but I'm not 100%.
Yeah, okay. Everything you hear isn't made from real instruments, even though they are synthesized to sound as closest to a flute. There's basic waves. Everything you heard in the Game Boy cartridges developed so that they could be synthesized or mixed to sound like a violin. And part of the beauty of those soundtracks is like a musician hears that and it's fake. I mean, anyone could hear those soundtracks and know, no, that's not a real violin. It sounds like crap. But you can also tell that a lot of these games has like the font or the this violin is definitely the Final Fantasy sounding violin. So you would be able to derive just from the tonal quality or the sound of the instrument that, oh man, that's from Final Fantasy, right? And I think one of my favorite things about video game music is the restrictions allowed for composers to literally create the worlds they're in. With a lot more recent AAA titles, let's say God of War, or no, I mean, there's countless there. We're using real life orchestral instruments, and that's super awesome. God of War is one of my favorite series of all time, and there's so many crazy ways that can finally push the music. But apart from a music direction, in terms of building the world, we're working purely with an orchestral palette. And look, for that game, it'll suit the visuals as games are slowly pushing to make their graphics feel as realistic as possible. It makes sense. Their video game budgets are starting to rival movie studio budgets, and it's paying off. But kind of working in a restrictive palette allows you to, I guess, formulate or create your own worlds in sound. And I identify, I guess, as like a digital fusion musician. So, that's kind of, I guess it's a genre that encompasses real instruments with sounds of electronic stuff together. So, even though I could, hire a violin or a whole string orchestra for this thing, it's like, no, it sounds good as an electro synth pad, but then I'm going to put a sax on top of it, and it merges and creates a soundscape, which I think is quite unique and something that's quite synonymous in the genre of video game music. Yeah.
So I've got one final question for you. Mm-hmm. You've had this lifelong passion for video game music, and it comes through in everything you say. Mm-hmm. But I remember a friend's dad once said to me when I was 16 or 17, because I'd made like a very short jingle as a joke. I can't remember the exact context, but I played this 5-second jingle and then said the thing I was going to say, and it made it funnier. And he said, well, why don't you write jingles? It's a great job. And I was offended. I was like, that is like offensive to me as an artist.
Yeah.
I'm a musician. Yeah. I want to write my music and have people go like, wow, that's Will's music. But when you write music for a video game, we have certain games that are revered for their music, Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy, are great examples. But ultimately, most people will experience your music as sort of a secondary part of this broader experience. How does it feel to you being part of a larger whole or being considered a bit player in people's experience to things? Are you content with that?
In the context of being a composer for video games, yeah, I think I am. I mean, I'm content that if I can help build someone's experiences, it doesn't need to have like my name plastered over it. But if I know if I've contributed towards that, yeah, I have. I feel pretty good about that. And I guess the bonus is if people appreciate the music outside of that medium just on its own, right? I think to me at the core is still enhancing the experience for the gamer. That being said, like, where it's different to when I was a teenager is like when I was a teenager, I thought I only wanted to be a video game composer. And as I kind of grew up, I've spent most of my musical career gigging. or playing music out there. And I have my own original music that, reflects or it allows me to indulge a bit more in certain areas that I couldn't just by video games. Because if I'm just writing music for the sake of music, the good and bad thing is like the restriction thing is out the window. It's like, it's literally just whatever is up to my heart's, mind's, time, and budget's content, right? I have music that I write that might only reach the ears of two people, but knowing that I wrote that just for me, it might scratch that element itch a bit more than in the context of video games. So I think sanity wise, like writing video game music, of course, is still probably the dream job of the thing I want to do, as my main thing. But I've begun to, because like in the early 20s, so context, I'm 28. In the earlier years of being 20, I felt that, I wanted to, like, how come I haven't landed? I feel all this pressure, and I wanted all this, put all my eggs in one basket. I wanted to be a composer. I wanted to do this, blah, 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 blah. I wanted to feel all that comes from being a video game composer. And it wasn't, I guess, as I develop as just solely a musician, it wouldn't just be one facet of music that granted me, this type of satisfaction. There'd be multiple, branches of music that would allow me to explore different musical intellectual ideas, but even just different levels of satisfaction. So, to answer your question, I would be satisfied if I could, enhance the experience for someone, and it'd be great to have that recognition go beyond what the game stood for itself. But there's also other music that I'm involved in, whether it is my own or other people's original music, that I'd hold more personal, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it completely does. I think I can only draw the most oblique of parallels, and that language is like, doesn't make sense, but I can only draw the most sort of oblique understanding for myself. But there's certain things that I do where being part of something bigger gives me a huge kickback, and to feel that I'm contributing to somebody's appreciation of something I find valuable means a lot to me. But it's also nice occasionally to have things where people go, Will did that, and feel like that was all my own. And being able to, I think, flex both of those muscles matters.
Yeah.
So that I very much understand.
Yeah.
Julian, this has been a real pleasure for me. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Me too. It's yeah. Sorry, go on.
Oh, you go. No, please.
I was just gonna say, it's nice to. I don't get to talk about this often, even within my industry, but let alone with someone who I know outside of the industry. Like, obviously, we know each other from Smash, so it's kind of nice to have this conversation outside of that setting, and like all the questions were super engaging. Is sick.
So thanks for having me. It was no lie at the start when I said I was very excited to do this, because I'm very passionately interested in music as somebody who is not a pro, but just does love it. So to understand somebody's experience in doing something that feeds two passions that I have in this way is really great. So I really appreciate the time. Your last job before you go, though, is to tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your work, any gigs coming up, make any shout outs you want, make any call outs you want. I told you, controversy is good, but it's open slather. Just tell people anything you want to put out there.
Yeah, sweet. I should have asked this at the beginning of the podcast, but profanities were like...
It 100% fine.
Yeah, sick. I wasn't sure. I said a little bit, but kind of being. No,
I'm aiming not to be crude.
Yeah.
But I want to be authentic. So here and there, if I'm talking, the easiest way for me to convey something is to say shit. I'm not say shit.
Got it. Sweet. Yeah. Well, for all the formal, I guess like for all the stuff we've kind of discussed today, Zorsy San, S-A-N, because Sanchez, and also, Japanese prefix. Zorsy San, you can find it on nearly all socials: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. That is also my website, zorsysand.com.au. Yeah, most of the time I'm kind of talking about music, or I'll have updates for things I want to plug over there, as well as like random smash clips. That's the formal stuff. The informal stuff, fucking Bundan, you ripped me on, like, you invited me to Fight Night and then you uninvited because you found Ant.
Did he do that?
Nah, he was like, "Hey, bro, you free? Cause Goody pulled out." I was like, "I think I'll be free. Yeah, I should be down." So I kind of want my heavyweight kind of contender rights.
You know what? I'll organise that for you. I'm going to talk to him right after this. That's,
yeah, good.
That's poor form from Brandon.
Yeah, not happy. Are you guys coming to Cavern?
Yes. I haven't formally announced this in as far as I need to formally announce it, but I think I'm going to go to Mexico. I have been really stinging for a holiday for a long time.
Hectic.
And I kind of have like 1 week between now and the end of the year where I can go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was in the process of booking flights, and I think I'm going to literally try to fly home so I get home on Friday so that I can come to Metal Cabin. So yeah.
Funny.
It'll be fun.
Yeah, sick. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Nah.
Well, do you have any gigs coming up?
Yeah, man, like gigs that are worthwhile plugging, not as much, because, like, you know, there's a whole bunch of weddings, and man, there's a Wednesday night that I play every week. That's this really nice restaurant in Randwick called Clove Lane. So close by to you, fairly.
It's very close to me.
Yeah.
If I ever have an occasion to bring a date somewhere,
yeah, exactly.
I'll go there and flex the fact I know the musicians.
yeah. If you get on the Skype, and then I'll do a nice plug and be like, "Oh yeah, man, saved me from, you know, a fire trial."
I could join you on stage if I really wanted to scare them off.
Bro,
yeah.
Please. Otherwise, as soon as I have something worth plugging, like originals and stuff, I will, like, you'll see me not shut up on socials. So
unreal. Well, again, thank you so much, man. This has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it a lot. And everybody else, I will talk to you probably when I'm back from Mexico.
Yeah, that's right. I'll talk to you either Metal Cabin or when you're back from Mexico, or I'll just see you on the queues. Yeah, that's
no doubt.
For sure. All right.
See you, man.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. Bye. Cool. Thank you, Will. Thank you.